Welcome to a big day, the launch of the 10th annual Forest 500 report called Forest 500, A Decade of Deforestation Data. I'm Louise Boyle, the Senior Climate Correspondent at The Independent. For 10 years, Global Canopy has been assessing the 350 companies and 150 financial institutions with the greatest ability to drive change on tropical deforestation. They are assessed on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. And as this is the 10th report, we have a decade of learnings from 10 years of data. Forests, particularly tropical forests, are one of our greatest natural allies when it comes to fighting the climate crisis. They are incredible carbon sinks, storing up carbon emissions from the atmosphere. On the flip side, cutting down and clearing trees turns forests into carbon emitters. Deforestation is responsible for 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. At COP28 in Dubai this year, world leaders appeared to be getting to grips with the idea that forests must be a cornerstone of reining in dangerous global temperature rise. For the first time, leaders unanimously agreed to include a commitment to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030 in the final text. So on to our speakers. The panel we have today, first we'll be hearing about the data. Niki Mardas is the Executive Director of Global Canopy. He's the man with the numbers. Pierre Cannet is Global Head of Public Affairs and Policy at Client Earth. Grace Iara Souza is a social scientist with a PhD in political ecologies of the Amazon and beyond. And Giulia Carbone is Director of Natural Climate Solutions at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Given that we're focusing on tropical deforestation, it seems most appropriate to start with you, Grace. And I wondered if you could begin with talking to us a bit about the current situation in the Amazon.
Thank you, Louise, and I'm sorry, everybody, that I'm not Shinea Wapshana, and neither I'm trying to be or an indigenous person, as far as I know. So, yes, I was in Brazil recently visiting one of my trips, and I just came from Acre, and I was there end of October, November, and then again in December for the Chico Mendes week, and it was devastating to observe the impacts of the drought. So in order to reach communities, through navigating the rivers in the Amazon, and I was supposed to go to the Amazonas state as well, and I couldn't go because of the drought at that time. It was really, really devastating to see the impacts to the local communities, but also the impacts to the fishes, to the impact to the biological conservation in the region. However, if you turn on to the news today, you're going to see that there is a massive flood of water happening in Acre. So communities that I visited before and were having difficulties to reaching their places, they are now navigating canoes inside the communities, not even to go from one place to the other. And that is really, really difficult to manage, but also to think how those big commitments with climate emergency are not translating to adaptations to the people who are managing to support the protection of the rainforest on behalf of the rest of the planet.
Yeah, thank you. Let's turn now to the findings of this year's report. It's called A Decade of Deforestation Data. So Niki Mardas, Executive Director of Global Canopy, what does 10 years of the data tell us?
Well, thank you very much, Louise. Thank you, Grace, and the other panelists and the audience. Thank you so much for joining this event. And I just want to start with another thank you to our incredible team of partners. A vast amount of work goes into these assessments in 18 plus languages. We annually refine the methodology, field questions from companies, support progress, and help drive best practice. And you multiply that by 10 years and you end up with more than, well, or rather almost 1.5 million data points on market-driven deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. And that has become, it is a vital data source for the future of the world's forests. And the data is now being used in decision-making more and more by responsible investors, screening portfolios, by companies engaging their suppliers, governments committed to ending deforestation. And it's also widely used by campaigning organizations because overall, we are seeing a story of ongoing inaction in the face of growing risk. So you ask about the 10 years, Louise. After 10 years, even with this issue ever more in the spotlight, as droughts and fires have raged in the Amazon, now Grace talking about floods, even with high-profile corporate commitments for a solution to this problem by 2020 that never came, even with governmental consensus, we now have more than 140 countries coming together at the Glasgow COP, as was mentioned, to say deforestation must come to an end. Even with the annual identification, assessment, and engagement of 500 companies, the Forest 500, each of them with huge resources, driving the bulk of this problem at the heart of the intertwined crises of climate, nature, and human rights. Even with all of this, almost a quarter of the companies and financial institutions that we have been putting in the spotlight for a full decade of annual rankings still have not made a single meaningful commitment to address this issue. And that includes companies like Deichmann, Europe's biggest shoemaker based in Germany, Bright Food, China's second largest food and beverage company, and many of the world's biggest investors. Mentioned Vanguard in particular, one of the top 3 investors globally, because they have the most money invested in high-risk companies according to our analysis, yet have no policy after 10 years in the spotlight. So it's a decade of remarkable corporate obstinance on a truly important issue. Yet over those 10 years, we at least have also seen pockets of hopeful progress. So it's not all negative. But overall, if we have to take a snapshot, it's a story of woeful inaction. But we've learned many lessons. We've seen progress. We have 10 lessons that we share in the report from 10 years. Please do download the report. You can visit the website, forest500.org, which has all the results. But I'm going to give you a very quick whistle-stop tour of those 10 lessons. So I'm going to group them together for speed. So first of all, the first group, voluntary action just doesn't cut it. That's actually our lesson number 1. Forest 500 helped to demonstrate unequivocally a few years ago that those 2020 commitments I mentioned would be missed, and that voluntary action had to be backed up by legal requirements. So lawmakers in the EU, the world's biggest market, have listened, and the UK is now set to follow suit. Other governments are talking about doing the same. And this year, 2024, saw legislation come onto the books in Europe requiring all companies trading in or with the bloc to undertake due diligence on deforestation. The law's not perfect. We're going to hear much more about this from Pierre in a moment. But one key omission I wanted to mention relates to our lesson 2, and that's the fact that the law does not apply to finance, to the all-powerful finance sector. Now, this is going to be formally reviewed in both the EU and the UK over the next 18 months to 2 years. We will be making the strongest possible case for the inclusion of finance, but the data, guidance, and know-how are all there for the finance sector. And we can see from a decade of evidence that without legislation, we're going to continue to see the sector as a whole, despite what some leaders are doing, the great work some leaders are doing, the sector as a whole will continue to lag way behind. So that's the first set. The second set of lessons I wanted to share are around the big middle, what we call the big middle. So the majority of companies are keeping their heads beneath the radar, a big middle of insufficient action. Now, campaigners and the media rightly make a noise about the laggards, focus on the laggards. The leading companies themselves are vocal about their own progress, that's fair. But the big middle, the majority of companies, doing enough to stay out of the limelight, but nowhere near enough to contribute to actual sectoral change, they keep quiet, by and large. So Forest 500, with its detailed and annually iterated methodology, tries to leave nowhere to hide. Here are 3 types of below the radar behavior that we've seen over these 10 years. So lesson 4 relates to partial commitments. So almost 40% of Forest 500 companies have published a deforestation commitment for at least one commodity, but not for other areas that may have higher exposure. So for instance, global fashion group Inditex, owner of brands that we all know, like Zara and Bershka, have a commitment on deforestation. They recognize this as a problem. They have a commitment on timber, use of timber, but not for leather, which of course, as a fashion group, is their highest area of exposure. That's a problem. Other brands in this group of partial commitments in different ways include Aldi, Domino's, Carrefour, Walmart, some humongous companies. In the same group, less than 5 of our 10 relates to commitments versus implementation. So almost 2/3 of the Forest 500 companies have commitments, but don't show evidence on implementation of those commitments, even though we're setting a low bar for measuring that reporting on implementation. So this really is a big one. I mean, what is this about if not about implementation on the ground or in supply chains? And this includes companies like Adidas, Starbucks, and Gap. So again, huge brands. And lesson 6 is on transparency. Transparency is essential. Action without reporting is a kind of below the radar behavior, as far as we're concerned, that evades accountability and fails to misses the opportunity to send a critical signal to the rest of the market. And one issue actually we have with the laws coming through, which we think are much needed, but they don't necessarily lead to public transparency, which could have some perverse outcomes. So perhaps something Pierre will say more about. So the third set of lessons, moving on. Public pressure has a key role to play in achieving change. So our lesson 8 is that palm oil has seen far higher action among companies than other commodities. And that's at least in part, I mean, there are many reasons, there's credible certification schemes, that, you know, it's a complex picture, but at least in part, this is due to the major campaigns globally targeting big brands on palm oil. And now palm oil deforestation, or, you know, over the last few years, the last block of data we have shows palm oil deforestation at just 18% of its peak. So we've seen change there. Now, that's far from job done. It's hugely complex, but these are striking statistics following on from major public campaigns. And lesson 9, conversely, shows that cattle, despite being the single largest driver of deforestation, a more significant, considerably driver than palm oil, has low uptake by companies. Companies are not making commitments on cattle. So while just 30% of companies have a policy on leather, those that have high exposure, I'm always talking about here, 35% of companies have a policy on beef. That number for palm oil is more than double, it's 76%. So it's a striking difference. And if there's a place now to focus campaigning energy, this is it. This is the biggest single driver of deforestation worldwide. And also this kind of pressure, I mean, this is where each of us here today can contribute. Let's ask our banks, our supermarkets, our pension funds, is my money driving deforestation? It's a simple question, but it's a powerful one if enough of us ask it. It's a bit awkward for them, and it helps. So let's ask that question. And the fourth group of lessons, action on deforestation is a triple win. Okay, I think we all know this, but let's talk a little bit about some of the evidence around this. So lesson 7 for us, I mean, there is no solution to climate change without a solution to deforestation, yet only 6% of these highly exposed companies in the Forest 500 who have strong net zero commitments are also making strong progress on deforestation. So that, you know, that is a picture that will have to change if net zero commitments are to be taken seriously and achieved. Currently, it's just 6% who are crossing a bar on deforestation. Plus, action on deforestation is the best way for companies to also get started on addressing the biodiversity and nature crisis. More commitments coming through. We've had the Montreal Kunming Agreement. 80% of terrestrial biodiversity is in tropical forests. And then lesson 3 for human rights, triple win for climate, for nature, and for human rights, where companies are just refusing to budge. I mean, the data is not good on human rights. We'll hear, I think, a bit more from Grace on just how strong the linkages are between market-driven deforestation and associated human rights abuses that often precede a company and follow deforestation. Not always, but there's often that link. And this is a critical area for private sector action. We can't decouple human rights abuses from the deforestation. It's all part and parcel of the same story. So my final message to wrap up, and the final lesson of the 10 that we've shared in the report, is that the Forest 500 and its 1.3 million data points over 10 years shows that change is possible. I mean, we've seen it with palm oil. Now, just in the last year, the last 24 months, if we look at the most recent data, we're seeing individual companies and investors showing rapid progress is possible. If there's the will, I mean, this is a question of will now. The tools, the data, the guidance have all got better. We have case studies now being shared on how to make progress very openly by groups like the New Finance Sector Deforestation Action Group. We have the information. This is a solvable crisis, and there really is no excuse for inaction. So thank you very much, Louise. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Niki. Thank you for breaking that down. Remember, this webinar is being translated into Portuguese, so you are able to choose your language. Also, there should be time for questions, so please continue to use the Q&A box. Pierre Cannet, Global Head of Public Affairs and Policy at Client Earth. He is the law expert. And the top line of this report is that regulation is vital to drive change. Pierre, please could you explain the current regulatory system and what is out there and what's coming, please?
Thank you for the invitation. And to respond to your question, it's probably important to ask ourselves how many decision makers and companies, corporate stakeholders will remain blind to this disaster and tragedy across the world. And I think as a legal charity and with other environmental NGOs, many scientists, representatives from indigenous people and local communities, very active in the past years and past decades, and over the past decades have probably helped to open the eyes of many decision makers. And I was there at the European Parliament when the EU deforestation regulation was voted. And for many activists, for many experts and policy experts and law experts, it was a very emotional moment to see, after years and years, this decade of efforts, to see the EU finally regulating and putting in place these new regulations to tackle the deforestation and tackle the deforestation from start. So making sure that we can have the guarantee that the consumers, that the market are seeing deforestation-free products on the market. So it's been a huge amount of efforts. And I think thanks to the evidence brought today with the reports from Global Canopy, Forest 500, it's also very useful to see what is at stake and understanding from the current regulations what needs to be done. And so I'd say that this is the year, 2024. This is the year for many markets to tackle this crisis. We have EUDR. This is a new reality at the EU level. So nobody can actually say we are surprised by this regulation, because it's been years of regulations and discussions, and now it needs to be implemented. And there was this window of 18 months for everybody to be prepared, from the member states and being able to put in place competent authorities, making sure we have the capacity and the budget in place, making sure that companies are also ready to implement this regulation, and also working for and with producer countries to enable this change from start, from the producer countries. And that is a huge effort that needs to be done also from the EU. And I'd say it's very important to focus then this year on the implementation and enforcement components of this regulation. That is the focus we'll have this year as Client Earth with many other partners. There is also another page to open in the UK, making sure that the revision will be enough stronger as well regarding human rights protection as well. And I'd like to share also from COP28 a moment that was very important from Brazil with an event with the Minister of Justice, the President of the Supreme Court, Barroso, who actually shared the following, saying that judges can't be blind when we see actually currently the land being grabbed for deforestation against indigenous people rights. And that was a very strong statement from the Minister of Justice saying judges can't be blind. And I'd like to conclude to respond to your question with that. Having the regulation in place is important, but we need to understand this regulation being as well enforced and understanding the life cycle of the law from building the field, helping corporate to implement with guidance and tools, helping as well the courts to be able as well to tackle if it is not fulfilled, and making sure that through the courts, we can as well find the solutions. And of course, the improvements that will need to be done at the EU level as well. This is a point we're going to follow as well regarding the improvements to make under EUDR and in the UK as well.
Can you just expand a little bit more, Pierre, on those improvements? You know, we've had the current state of play. You know, what more needs to be done here? What's missing?
Yes, sometimes I've heard as the EU deforestation regulation was concluded, you're too ambitious, perhaps as environmental NGOs, or you're asking too much. And I'd like to respond saying that the urgency, we see it from Forest 500 and many science, that we don't have time. And so that's why the regulations should be as well at the level. And this is where in the EU deforestation regulation, other improvements can be done and are already included in the timeline and schedule for EU stakeholders. So I would perhaps start with finance, making sure it can be integrated. It was a big point of discussion during the preparation of the regulation. We need to understand that forest is a full ecosystem, understanding that we have so-called other wooded lands. What about the savanna, for instance, to be protected? And so we have also indigenous people and local communities depending on these other ecosystems, and this will be an important improvement to make. And I say as well in the UK, the importance to see and learn from the failures in the past, especially regarding human rights, on how this can be done. And on the compliance, there is still in the debate the possibility to have a race to the top or to the bottom. So many things regarding as well the compliance and how we can respond to the non-compliance as well as being hopefully well defined. So it's a message as well to keep our eyes open and be mobilized, because I feel even if we have the EU deforestation, it can and needs to be improved, but it needs to be both implemented and enforced. And this is the big work to be done in the coming months to ensure that finally we are having stakeholders tackling deforestation and protecting human rights.
Yeah, thank you so much. Grace, if we come back to you now, one of the truly shocking things from these statistics is the complete absence of thinking about human rights and addressing human rights and the policies and commitments of these 500 companies and financial groups. And from what Pierre has said about due diligence laws, that these also largely ignore human rights. Can you tell us how deforestation and land conversion are linked to human rights abuses?
Thank you, Louise, definitely. It's very important for us here in the UK or wherever you are to think about how we are importing deforestation with indigenous peoples and local communities' blood. So for instance, I mean, the market-driven deforestation has several different impacts on human rights. So for instance, if we think about the soya coming from the Amazon or the Atlantic forest and other places within Brazil and other biomes, leaving indigenous peoples without their territory, which is so important for their human and environmental security and for the continuation of their culture as well. We can think about the pesticides, you know, that is impacting, polluting and villages, rivers, and territories in general. We can think about displacement, different forms of displacement. We can start by, highlighting livelihood displacement and physical displacement, and how that impact human health and security. We can talk about the violence against indigenous peoples and local communities because of the demands for those lands for agribusiness, particularly. We can think about how the fishes that the Munduruku people are being impacted by mercury because of mining. We can talk about, how the Yanomamis are being impacted by mining as well. But very, very important, I think it's crucial to make the full link. So for instance, not long ago, Global Canopy and another organization called Size of Whales launched another report talk about pensions. And one of the people who were presented via video was the Guarani people from the Atlantic Forest. And they were showing how soya coming from their territory can be feeding chicken here in the UK or Wales, and that is having a huge impact to the indigenous peoples, and how pension is feeding into the financing of that human rights and environmental rights violation. Traceability policies, crucial, and due diligence policies. How can we make sure that we are not importing indigenous people's blood when we are buying chicken to feed, when buying that is fed by soya, for instance, and there are numerous examples of those situations.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Grace. Giulia Carbone, I'll turn to you now. You're Director of Natural Climate Solutions at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. If you could give us your reflections with a business hat on, please. Progress is evidently slow. How can we accelerate private sector action?
Well, thank you. And first, congratulations to Global Canopy for this really important report. I think 10 years, and we hope you're going to continue. This is important. I know it feels like, probably at a certain point you get tired, but it is by repetition that we are going to achieve something. Some of us have been in this business for much longer than 10 years, and we do feel like we are repeating, but that's so important. So the World Business Council works on three main imperatives: equity, nature, and climate. They are not separate. We try even internally to create synergies between the three, because there are synergies. I think what was just said, you are talking about deforestation, but effectively we are talking about climate change. We are certainly talking about human rights. And this is also what WBCSD is trying to push to its members. We have around 220 companies, and really to help them understand the synergies between these three imperatives. So basically, as it was already said, there is not net zero without nature. That's clear, right? And it's not a choice, it's not an elective. It's absolutely a must. Even if we do everything else technologically to get to net zero and we don't consider nature, we are not going to get to net zero. So that is also why we are pushing an agenda for nature. But I think also is important to recognize that the agenda for nature is not just to service climate, but nature and forest also have their own role on their own, and not just for climate mitigation. And so bringing all these pieces together, what WBCSD is doing. So for example, we have launched a number of roadmaps for nature positive to help companies understand their impacts and dependency on nature, which, as we all are working in biodiversity and nature, we know it's extremely complex, especially for companies that have long value chains, and understand for different levels of maturity how to address them. And this is by bringing together other tools such as the TNFD, SBTN, all these acronyms that, however, behind which there is a lot of efforts, a lot of research that has to be done, a lot of data collection. So we are trying to get companies to understand the landscape out there and what does it mean for them, And then spell this out by sector, because it makes a big difference if you are in agri-food, or if you're in forest, or if you're in building, or if you are in the mining sector. So we have a number of these roadmaps that are sector specific. We have launched, as I said, I think 12 one on agriculture and forestry, and then this year we're working on others, so really trying to define what are the most important actions for those sectors in order to avoid and minimize the risk of nature, and then indirectly also to climate. At the same time, we are also working on promoting investments beyond value chain, which is this new concept. So it's in value chain and beyond value chain. And this is mostly through the voluntary carbon market, but very, very strongly focusing on natural climate solutions, because we do believe that the voluntary carbon market can channel funds to nature in natural climate solution, of which there is, avoided unplanned deforestation, which is REDD+, where the voluntary carbon market has, with a lot of criticism, but there is a lot of improvement in methodology, can really play a key role. Now, again, voluntary carbon market is in addition to what companies would do to decarbonize their own scope, 1, 2, and 3. And finally is, how do we mobilize direct finance towards companies that address their risk and footprint on nature? So this is also a work that we are doing also in partnership with the Global Canopy and others through the Forest Finance Risk Consortium, and really understand what were the blocking points for financial institutions. And the big answer was data. It's complex. We don't know where to find the data. How do we understand how to do a due diligence on our portfolio? Difficult. So one of the, I think, important milestones last year, and I think it was important because it brought together a lot of NGOs. So it wasn't done only by WBCSD, it was done with Global Canopy and many others to kind of bring together all the tools that are out there that could be used by financial institutions to assess their portfolios, right? And in a way, we're kind of answering to financial institutions saying, now there are really no excuses. You can choose depending on your situation, depending on the data, depending on portfolio, but there are a lot of very valuable tools out there, supported also by new technologies that really allow you to actually have a very good understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, that's great, Giulia. Thank you so much. I mean, the heart of this report, it makes clear that is regulation. And I just wondered, could you speak a bit more to that and what role that regulation will have?
Yeah, so I picked one of the sentences. Well, first of all, I also checked, personally, I like all the 10 recommendations. I checked also my colleagues and said, we like them all. The one that is not that we don't like it, but we would challenge is when you say voluntary actions from corporates doesn't cut it. I would say alone doesn't cut it, right? And because I would, we can't not forget the importance that voluntary action plays in raising the bar, right? And even informing regulation. So we see that a lot of movements, let's say, especially in Europe, but on things that are now becoming the minimum common denominator requirement by the law, started really as voluntary action 20 years ago. So now definitely that's too slow, way too slow. We don't have that time now. But I think leaders also send a signal, leaders that take action voluntarily, send a signal to our, policymakers to say, it's okay to regulate on this. And then, to create that level of, level playing field. But I think voluntary action taken by leaders creates somehow a kind of gives some kind of permission to regulators often to say, yes, this is something that we can start regulating on. We have a number of experiences where also I think regulations would not be able to solve the problem because they're complex. So, for example, we have our soft commodity forum working in Brazil, where we bring together many companies on a landscape to collaborate. It will be I think will be impossible for a regulator to say, and now you collaborate on pre-competitive issues, right? So there is also that willingness that companies have to bring voluntarily to the table. So it's not voluntary doesn't cut it, it's only voluntary doesn't cut it.
Thanks so much, Giulia. The thoughts have been fascinating so far, and we're going to try and find some time. We're running a little over, but to get some questions in. So let me now just jump to the Q&A box and see if I can grab one here. Okay, here's one to begin with. How do, and this is open to everyone, how do NGOs effectively mobilize public opinion in support of this environmental catastrophe? Who'd like to jump in there?
I would say why
Go
only
ahead,
NGOs?
Gina.
Sorry. I would say why only NGOs? I think businesses have a very powerful voice, and I think that, you know, certainly WBCSD is pushing a lot on this advocacy, and especially on the more international fora. So we are present at CBD, at COP, really bringing the voice of business to actually push the agenda and raise the bar. So, of course, you know, there is two different constituencies, but I would say let's not forget leaders. Business leaders also can have a very powerful voice.
Niki, can I turn back to you?
Thanks. Yeah, I was just going to say that there is an anomaly that, you know, the overall public sentiment on deforestation, when you ask the question directly, you get a very high. So our partners Make My Money Matter did research saying, you know, what do you least want your pension associated with? And deforestation came top of the list. But then that doesn't translate into the everyday use of products. So groups like Make My Money Matter have done fantastic campaigns. Some of the big campaigning organizations doing work on palm oil, we've seen have been very successful. But to me, I think we need to mobilize people with good information about the companies that we all engage with directly. And this brings me back to this point of all of us, you know, have a bank account. You know, let's call your bank, call your pension provider, ask them about whether your money is driving deforestation. And we've got information that can be used to support that effort. So, I mean, it's definitely a gap. We definitely need to do more, but I agree also very much with Giulia. It needs to be across sectors.
Thank you so much. One now for you, Pierre. If regulation is key, are you confident that organisations in breach of the new EUDR regulation will be suitably penalised?
Yes, so first of all, I think it's about this critical moment to influence the implementation and the enforcement. And this is when we are acting as Client Earth, member state by member state, to see as well the application of penalties across member states. We have already in the regulation a list of penalties, including, for instance, the confiscation of non-compliant products, fines as well, with a maximum of at least 4% of annual union-wide turnover as described. And we have, you know, possibilities then from this list from member states to make sure that all of that is being included and implemented as well by independent or agencies. And so I will share in the chat the brief reproduced so that you have all the examples regarding these penalties. It would be critical about the sanctions and the penalties, because it's also the way the corporate stakeholders will also be able to implement and follow the rules as well. Very important part of the regulation to be implemented and enforced by member states.
Thank you. We're into the last 5 minutes of the webinar now, and I want to give everyone on the panel 1 minute to answer this question. There have been promises before on deforestation that haven't been met, but the deadline of halting and reversing deforestation by 2030 is finally in a COP text, and it's coming up on us very fast. So are you optimistic? Maybe Grace, I can start with you there.
Thank you, Louise, for asking, and everybody else in the panel. I'm not that optimistic, and one of the reasons is because, as the report just launched by Global Canopy today is showing that those organizations that have been making promises, they have delivered very little to their promises. So I think I worked with carbon credit like when it was the beginning of this story, like 15 years ago, and I don't think we have time, you know, for offsetting. We don't have time for commitments. We need delivery. And I think that is what the indigenous peoples and local communities are expecting to now, expecting now. They're suffering the impacts of climate emergency today with drought and floods and, to their peoples in general. So it's time for reducing our consumption in general. It's time to hold accountable our politicians and banks and universities and everybody else, for importing deforestation and not delivering on traceability policies. Thank you, and congratulations to Global Canopy.
Giulia, let me turn to you and ask you the same question.
So I'm not sure it's about optimism. Actually, I am not optimistic, which is really sad in a way, because I have kids, and just to tell them that it's just the future is not that bright. But I honestly don't think we have any other choice than keep fighting this battle, because it could be, without this could be much worse. Now, definitely we haven't made enough progress. And let me just answer one of the questions I've seen that was for me, is like saying that if I said that the leaders are enough. No, leaders are not enough. I said leaders light the way, and then we need to mainstream, which is the most difficult step. And I think Niki, when he was talking about the middle ground companies, was really referring to those. But it's not about being optimistic. It's about saying that we really have no other choice than trying our best to keep pushing.
Yeah. Pierre, same question to you.
I don't think it's about optimism as well. I think we need to keep energized, because people who are just willing to slow down the agenda or also blocking the new regulations and their improvements are super mobilized and energized. And when we speak about deforestation, there is behind all the model as well of agriculture. And if we feel that at EU level, deforestation-free products regulation is in place, the transition for the agri sector is not at all done. And we are seeing across Europe big mobilization from farmers and sometimes lobbies. And so that's a critical moment to make sure, as we have elections in the coming months, to make sure that the next mandate will be stronger, and then we need to be energized to make sure that this is actually happening.
Thank you. And Niki, as Director of Global Canopy, I'll turn to you for the final word on this.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think these points, I can't say it better. I mean, we need to stay energized. That was essentially going to be my point. We have to stay focused, because this battle is not going to win itself. We can see there isn't enough mobilization. We need to get there. There are good opportunities in the political calendar. We have a nature COP this year in Colombia. We have next year's climate change COP in Belém in the Brazilian Amazon. All eyes will be on deforestation. We have to make that count. And there's nothing to say that won't do itself. We've been here before, we failed before. So I like very much this point about staying focused and energized. I also just would like to acknowledge that there are a huge number of fantastic questions in the Q&A box that we didn't manage to get to. So we've been conferring here to say that we will try and post a FAQ in due course where we address some of these. So please do come back to the website, because we hugely appreciate your engagement, which is part of this question of staying energized and mobilized. So let's keep a conversation going, and let's work together on this issue, because it has to be solved. So thank you very much, and thank you, Louise, and to all who've joined us today.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of our panelists, to Giulia Carbone, Niki Mardas, Pierre Cannet, and Grace Iara Souza. I would like to thank Global Canopy also for this report. And thank you to all of you for being with us. Feel free to read the report. You just need to go to the website, forest500.org. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.